So I've been asked to do a quick video to show how I do book cloth, and this is what you need to be able to make book cloth. You need some fabric. This fabric has been pre-ironed so it is nice and smooth. You don't want any wrinkles in your fabric. You need some wheat paste. You can either buy this or I make it. I make 2 tablespoonfuls of wheat flour to 10 tablespoonfuls of water and 1 teaspoonful of salt, and put it in a double boiler and just keep stirring it until it thickens to sort of this consistency, which is a paste consistency. You need a brush for pasting, a brush for smoothing out any bubbles, some paper for backing. I'm using washi paper, which I got from a very well-known site. I get a roll for about 12 meters, and this is good because it's rough on one side and smooth on the other, and the rough side, which is the inside, is the side that I'm going to paste to my fabric. You'll also need some glass or some perspex to put the fabric onto, and what I do as well is use a sprayer bottle. So I use the sprayer bottle to spray the fabric so it sticks to the perspex. So that's what you will need to start with. These bits of fabric came from an online store. They're already pre-cut, but you can use any fabric you like. It just needs to be smooth so that you can stick to it. So these are the first 2 pieces of fabric that I've chosen to turn into book cloth, and the first thing I need to do is make sure that my piece of paper is big enough to cover. Ideally you want a piece of paper which is bigger than your perspex as well, because you want it to stick down on the edges, and this is pre-cut, and that's ideal. Normally you would make sure there's a bigger gap, so normally you would do 1 piece like this, but I'm going to do 2 pieces. You need to make sure that there's a little bit of a gap around the edges of your fabric so that the book cloth can, not the book cloth, the paper can stick to the perspex, which means you get a nice smooth finish. This is the wrong way up, so the pieces of fabric will be face down, because you don't want to stick your paper to the good side of the fabric, you want to stick it to the back. Now this is going to move around, and this is why what I do is wet my fabric like this. Doesn't matter if you get the perspex wet, you want it to get nice and wet, so I'm going to wet both sides. And turn this back, and now this should be easier to stick to the perspex and it won't move. So I've tip it up, you can see that it's not moving. Want to make sure it's completely down. I'm going to do the same, put some water on there, to this piece of fabric. Don't worry if you think you put too much water on. The thing you mustn't do though is sort of run it under the tap and wring it out, because then you'll put lots of wrinkles in your fabric. So there we go. So line that up, and you can see the water has actually taken a little bit of size out of the fabric. It's pulled the fibres tight, so there's a little bit more of a gap than there was when I was just laying the dry fabric down. Now we put that to one side, and then we can start pasting our paper. I'm going to do this on this piece of perspex. The reason I'm doing it on this piece of perspex is it will lift off easier than my cutting mat, because my cutting mat has got holes in it. So I use my wheat paste, and you need to apply it quite liberally. Don't worry that the paper is rolling up at the moment. Once you start getting the wheat paste onto it, it will start sticking to the perspex, and it will go quite translucent. You've got to be a bit careful that you don't actually go through the paper once you've actually got quite a lot of wheat paste on it. See, I'm being quite thick with the wheat paste, and I want to make sure it goes right to the edges. This is another reason why you cut your paper bigger, and you can see the paper there is just starting to tear. You cut your paper bigger than the fabric so that you can actually pick it up and lay it. And also, if you haven't quite gone to the edges, it will still stick. So, there's a bit of a hole there. There's a little bit of a hole, don't worry. You can always patch it with another piece of paper later. I'm not going quite right to the edge, this edge, because this is the edge that I will lift. So that's my paper pasted. The next thing to do is to lift this and lay it over the fabric. Now that's quite tricky. So I'm going to move this out of the way and put the fabric back in place and then lay it over. Right, my fabric is back in place. I'm going to very carefully lift my glued paper off the perspex, and I'm going to carefully lay it down. You've got to be careful that it doesn't stick to itself, because once it starts sticking to itself, it's almost impossible to get it apart. And then you very gently, get my hand out of the way, layer it over the fabric, trying not to have any air bubbles in it. Try and get it smooth as possible. There we go. And it's over the fabric. Now I take my brush, and you start from the center and gently brush out to take out any air bubbles that you might have. Try and keep my hand out of the way. And also to smooth down the paper onto the perspex. So my other hand here. And just quickly do the other one. And you can see that the colour starts to come through. I've got a little bit of a ridge there. Don't worry too much about it, because this is the bit that you'll be sticking to your grey board. And so just smooth it out. Again, make sure there's no air bubbles around the edges. That piece is just folded over. You can just see, and I can just very carefully lift it off and redo it. So now that is stuck, and I need to let this dry. I let it dry overnight, 24 hours. But the rule of thumb is, if it still feels wet or damp or cold, it's not ready. Once it feels dry and isn't cold to the touch, then you can peel your paper off and you'll have your book cloth. So I'll come back tomorrow and peel it off and show you what we've now got. So here we are 24 hours later, and as you can see, this has started to lift anyway, and it's dry and not cold to the touch. So we can now peel this off the perspex, and there we have our book cloth. I don't know if you can see, but there's where the paste was sticking to the perspex, it's quite shiny. That's what you're looking for. So what we can do now is we can trim these pieces up. Don't worry if they are slightly bobbled, because you can always iron them on the back, and I would advise using a pressing cloth. But that's basically the process of making book cloth.